Hey guys, how's it going? Jason Sensational here, and welcome back to the channel for another top 8 decks to climb video. With seasonals coming up in just under about 2 weeks or so, you have about, this week and next week to climb. And the meta has been shifting in a sort of weird way, and I just want to show you guys some pretty cool decks that maybe have been under your radar or just, I think, are overall good decks to climb. Because as we get to the end of the season, now is sort of getting to the crunch time if you want to get a good spot for seasonals, or if you just want to qualify for all at seasonals, or even if you're having trouble with the meta nowadays, these might be some decks that could help you out depending on what you face, and or maybe just look for something new to play. So without further ado, please like and subscribe to the video if you do enjoy this content, but let's jump right into it. Alright, so to no one's surprise, yet again, the first deck that we have here is Kennen Ahri. This week, however, I am introducing the Go Hard version instead of the Shreema version that I think I've usually listed on this channel for the past couple videos on the decks to climb. The main difference of this version is the access to Go Hard. No surprise, that's pretty much what the deck is about, but the addition of Go Hard allows you to have so much more play. Because now you have a little bit more removal and heal into aggro. You can use pack your bags in the mirror to really gain that advantage. And what I think is unique about the Go Hard variants, or at least I think most variants nowadays, are sort of catching on to this, but the addition of Sign and Thousand Tailed in this deck is really key in just helping you steamroll, outvalue your opponents, apply a lot of pressure, play around a lot of these control decks that rely on cards like Withering Wail to kind of clear out your elusives. Getting that +1 buff to everything, drawing 2 cards to select through your deck to get the Go Hards is really powerful in this kind of deck. And I think the Go Hard variant of Kennen Ahri really accentuates the strength of Sign in Thousand Tails. Another really cool thing about this deck is you are able to use Godwillow Seedling on that Sign in Thousand Tails to gain even more value. And that's a really cool aspect about this deck, just having a lot more flexibility, a lot more card draw, and a lot more ability to really just outvalue and outgrind your opponents. But overall, I think within the meta, Kennen Ahri still remains one of the top dogs. Even though a lot of decks try to counter it, I think it still has pretty decent matchup spreads into most of his counter decks, and has at least a winning chance into a lot of them. Go Hard just really helps you gain a little bit more edge, because now decks like Spiders or some other aggro decks that just have these 1 health units that get really aggressive, they can now be answered by cards like Go Hard. Moving on to the next deck, we have Scouts. I think this, to no one's surprise, made the list this week, but at least to my surprise, I didn't really expect it to come out in how strong of a force it really did. Scouts has quickly become the most played deck on ladder in at least Americas, and I'm pretty sure across the world as well. Scouts has risen really quickly due to its favored matchup into Ahri Kennen and into a lot of other sort of slow control decks around in the meta. With cards like Ranger's Resolve, you're really able to protect a lot of your units against said cards that came into the meta to try to counter Kennen Ahri. So cards like Withering Wail really suffer into cards like Ranger's Resolve. Ice Shard really suffers into it because you can essentially nullify a lot of your opponent's board-wide removal. With the addition of the Scout keyword plus the Rally spells, you can often not just help steamroll down your opponents. And right now, a lot of decks just don't really have a good way of answering Misfortune, especially when paired with a card like Sharpsight or Ranger's Resolve. It's surprisingly hard to get rid of Misfortune, and this deck really helps you to level up Misfortune, because once Misfortune levels up, it becomes a huge threat to close out the game, because that usually means they also have a couple Scout units as well to really steampile the deck forward. I think one aspect of Scouts that was really popular, but is no longer really seeing much play, is Stony Suppressor. Stony Suppressor was really put into this deck to really counter a lot of these spell-heavy decks. So against Ahri Kennen, Stony Suppressor would just be this huge threat. In the past, it was a main counter against decks like Lee Sin or TF Fizz. But within these variants nowadays, it's just not really that necessary to have as a counter, or even if it does make your Ahri Kennen matchup a lot better, but it makes a lot of your other matchups a lot worse. So depending on how you really want to tech out this deck, you can put in Stony Suppressor if you are only pretty much facing Ahri Kennen. I will say another change I think has been made to this deck is that Jagged Butcher has now been replaced by Pertinent Squire. Or at least in some capacity. Just giving yourself an extra ability to have a challenger unit gives you that slight bit of interaction that you need within this deck, because you don't have single combats, you don't have concerted strikes, you don't really have any removal besides your challengers or forcing your opponent to block. So just Pertinent Squire in that slot, having a little bit more challengers, really helps out the deck. So the next deck we have here is Pantheon Taric, and so for the next, I think, 2 or so decks, you'll see a pretty common theme, and that theme is to beat up on scouts. With scouts rise in prevalence in the meta, a lot of decks are really looking to prey on this, because scouts, while it does have a good matchup spread, while it does have a good win rate, and while it does have a good performance overall in the meta, actually is a relatively frail deck. A lot of decks that can go bigger than it, such as other Demacia decks like Sivir Auction or any sort of Pantheon deck, can really just crush and feed on scouts, and that's really where these sort of decks are coming back into the meta. Even though there is a lot of Ahri Kennen that just really dominates on these Pantheon decks, because scouts is such a big factor within the meta these days, decks like Pantheon Taric, Pantheon Shyvana, even like Mono Pantheon, although I think Mono Pantheon is probably like the worst of them right now. But I am showcasing guys Pantheon Taric because it has surprisingly the highest win rate of most decks I've seen. I think a 57% win rate across the last 7 days in America. Because not only does it really beat up on scouts, your ability to have Taric rally to just really beat down on a lot of these control decks makes this deck a big threat within the meta. This deck is just super strong and super flexible, with the ability to have Zenith Blade, go wide, go big, all sorts of different strategies to really beat up on your opponents, and of course the main factor of it is beating up on scouts. The deck itself hasn't really changed much. You still have Wounded White Flame and Zenith Blade to really carry the deck, and the addition of Taric just to help gain a little bit extra more value off of your cards, off your draw like Pale Cascade or Guiding Touch, getting extra overwhelms off of your Zenith Blade, or just duplicating your rallies just helps close out the game. The next deck, again, is the common theme. It's a Demacia deck that has a little bit extra PNZ removal and also goes bigger than scouts, aims to feed on it, and this is Jayce Lux. This is a deck I haven't really seen personally a lot, but it's showing good numbers within Masters in NA, and it is quite an impressive deck. It is pretty much a standard, typical Demacia mid-range deck, but just thrown in with a little bit of PNZ removal added into it. This features cards like Assembly Line, Forge Chief, the Maze Seeker package, just to really beef up your mid-game boards, and to give you a little bit of interaction with the challengers, with the Mystic Shots and the Thermal Beams, and just help you to out-tempo and out-pressure your opponent. Again, this is mainly in there to really beat up on scouts, but I think that with the flexibility of PNZ, it gives you a little bit more access to burn as well, while still being flexible enough to have cards in Demacia to really help contribute to your win condition. Lux as a whole is also just a really solid mid-range card. I think since Lux got buffed back to 5 mana, her ability to generate final sparks through and through makes it one of the strongest contenders for any mid-range decks out there that aren't probably Pantheon that go super tall. But this kind of deck has been performing really well on ladder, and I thought it was a good deck to show because I think it does have a good matchup in the scouts. It's showing good stats on the Runeterra AR, and I thought it was interesting enough to show you guys. Another deck that just really seems to never escape the highest win rates of the meta is Fizz Lulu. This is a Yordle Arms deck. This deck really hasn't changed much for the past couple weeks, really, and it doesn't really have any new matchups that it does particularly well into. But this style of deck, because it's so swarmy, because it can go so big, it has these hands where it can really beat up on like any deck. If you have a 6-wide board on the turn 4 or 5, they cast Yordle Arms. A lot of decks just often can't deal with it. You're able to go really wide really quickly. You can beat up decks like Pantheon because they don't develop as quickly. You can use the Lulu Chompers to challenge some of the smaller mid-range units, so potentially you can pick off the units from the scout decks. This deck is pretty flexible and has a pretty explosive hand that can often not race a lot of decks out there. It does have unfortunate matchups into Ahri Kennen, which I still think is Ahri Kennen favored. But this deck overall has sported some really high win rates over the past couple weeks. Hasn't really died down, hasn't even changed. The meta has been changing around it, but this deck has still stayed within it. Working off of a nice discard use discard cycle package, using the Flame Chompers with Lulu, having the Yordle Captain to buff up your elusives as well as the Flame Chompers, just gives you a little bit more board and helps you kind of steamroll some of your opponents. And of course, Yordle in Arms is one of the strongest tempo-oriented cards out there right now, and can just destroy your opponent in one attack and just gain the tempo advantage from there, or you have the burn necessary to get yourself over the top. Finally, we get to some of the fun stuff. These last 3 decks are certified bangers, and I'm really excited to share with you guys. So some of these might not necessarily be the best deck overall for climbing. However, I do think they have a very high skill ceiling, and should you spend the time and effort to learn some of these decks, I do think they have some pretty good matchup tables and can do pretty well for you if you decide to play them. The first deck we have here is a PNZ rendition of Nami TF. I did make a video of this earlier, I believe last week, and is a deck that has been brought back by Floppy Mudkip, a very high level player within the NA server. This is very reminiscent of the old TF Fizz, with the explosive ability to level TF as early as turn 5, but also having that extra ability to buff units with cards like Nami and Athlete Admiral Shelley. The addition of these 2 cards into the deck make this deck a lot more flexible, allowing you to go wide and tall on elusives, and right now a lot of decks just can't deal with elusives very well, or even if they can, they aren't able to trade them off and simply just stall out the game for a couple turns. To no one's surprise, Flip TF is still one of the strongest champions out there in the game, just to provide value, tempo, and pressure. Twisted Fate is super easy to level up, and if your opponent accidentally doesn't play around it, uses the removal on the wrong target, or even tries to save the removal for TF, but you don't play for that TF level up, and then they use a resource on something that doesn't need to be removed. It's this whole cycle of threat management. You have so many threats, you threaten so many potential threats as well, or you just buff your TF out of range with like a Nami. Whatever it may be, this deck has a lot of threats, it has a lot of elusive damage, and it has a lot of burn, which makes it quite well into a lot of control decks within the meta, some that can't really deal with these elusive wide boards, and it also does really well into Ahri Kennen, which I think is one of the strongest suites of a deck like this. If you did miss TF Fizz from the old days, this is a great deck right now. It is very tough. Its win rate is reflected of that because it is very low right now. But I think the deck overall has a super strong power level and can do really well into the meta should you decide to learn the deck. Another deck that is really surprising by how well it's doing is Ziggs Taliyah. This has sort of been rising up in popularity within the last week or so, I think sporting like a 55% win rate over the past 7 days, which is very impressive. I think this is a spin-off off of the Zillion, a deck that has also come into popularity, but I think is doing a lot worse regarding the meta. This sort of shares a similar characteristic where it has all the Shrima landmarks, countdown kind of things, has a tempo with the Endless Devout plus the Desert Naturalist, and it has the annoyance of cards like Unraveled Earth to grant your opponent units vulnerable. But I think the difference between this deck and Ziggs Xerath is that this deck is a lot more tempo oriented and can really put your opponent into some positions where they're super pressured and have to respond to your units or die trying. The Zillion deck is a lot more slower, it's more control-y, but it sort of lacks the real control tools of most other control decks to really stabilize, whereas this deck just goes in, beats you up, sorry, excuse me. It goes in, beats you up, and makes you regret yourself that you've played into Rockhopper or Endless Devout. I think this deck is doing quite well. It's pretty surprising. I did want to feature it because it was really interesting, and I would urge you guys to try it out for yourself. The last deck is Azir Irelia. This is also a little bit of a surprise to me. I was just checking its stats earlier today, and it actually had a pretty high play rate. I think like 1,000 to 2,000 games played in the last 7 days. So, you know, not the highest ranks, maybe like the 10th most played deck, but for a deck that has not seen play for months, seeing its resurgence is quite cool. The deck overall plays out itself the same way as it used to. It is a little bit slower now that Irelia is nerfed and the Blade Dances cost 2, but its ability to beat down on control decks and, again, Ahri Kennen is really, really powerful. With the meta so far, we've been seeing this sort of shift. We have the Ahri Kennen, we have the Scouts, and now we have sort of the aggro decks to try to beat up on the and Ahri. We have the mid-range decks trying to beat up on scouts, and then we have the control decks trying to beat up on the mid-range decks and the aggro decks. And finally, we're kind of coming full circle where now there's a lot of these anti-control decks out there. You have the Azir Irelia, you have the TF Nami, you have the Zillion. A lot of decks out there are just looking to beat up on these slow control decks, and Azir Irelia also fits that build. So I think for people trying to climb, if you guys are seeing a lot of control decks, a lot of these decks within today's video are out there to help you out. If you do want to play like Ahri Kennen as well, that does count as an anti-control deck. It is one of the strongest decks as well, and Scouts is showing good numbers. But I think all these decks are quite interesting. They're all sporting pretty high win rates, so definitely want to check those out if you are looking to climb within the last 2 weeks. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will leave all the deck links in the code in the description down below. If you like this video, please go leave a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out, guys, and thanks for watching.